Battle Cats is a very interesting game with much variety. In this game, there are many sorts of enemies that have different traits and such as Aku, Red, or even traitless. I don't know why this is a trait, but it is. Anyways, what I was going to say was, every single trait, well, almost every single trait, has something about it that makes it special, and in today's video, I'll be telling you what almost every single trait's special thing is. Okay, so traitless is a funny one. They don't really got much going for them. However, they're mainly starter enemies. The first enemy in the game that you encounter on Korea of Empire of Cats Chapter 1 is a traitless enemy, and most enemies that you meet in that chapter are traitless. Occasionally you'll see a red enemy or a floating enemy, but they're almost all traitless. The funny thing about traitless is they sometimes will have an ability, like every now and then, but mainly they're just there for damage and raw HP. Okay, on to our next trait, red enemies. Their main thing is just having insane DPS. One great example of this is the red cyclone. Like most cyclones, it's low range and, extremely fast DPS. Well, extremely fast attack rate. However, this one has 92,000 damage, which is around 500,000 DPS, which is insane. And on top of that, it has 1,000,000 health with 1 knockback. Another great example of this would be Cappy, an enemy you find in Stories of Legend, who, while has insane DPS of 29,000 and 52,000 hit damage per hit, is only single target, which makes him slightly easier to handle. He also has 530,000 HP, which is crazy for just a random enemy. So, the thing about floating is, they're kind of a sub-trait, because there could be an enemy that's red and floating, like the red cyclone, which can be counted as red as floating, or there could be an enemy that's just floating, like Muth, a very early game enemy that you encounter that's a floating enemy, or like the Face, the first major boss of the game, which is a floating enemy. But they're not really a trait. They're kind of a sub-trait. Metal enemies are the first, enemy with a gimmick to them. Their gimmick is really annoying, actually. They basically make it so that any damage dealt to them is reduced to 1 damage. So, basically, you just have to either hit them a lot, or use critical hits. Critical hits are hits that will deal 2 times the damage, and to metal enemies, they'll deal the correct amount of damage and don't get their damage reduced to 1, which is really helpful. But most units don't have good chances for critical hits, so most metal stages are hated by everyone in the community of Battle Cats. One good example of this that we see early on is Metal Hippo, which is pretty easy because he only has, I think, 100 health, which is pretty low even for early game, because you could just spam Giraffe Cat against him, who has a fast attack rate and a bunch of health, so he could pretty easily take down him. However, annoying enemy that has metal is Metal Seal with high damage and really annoyingly high health, and on top of that, it barely has any KB counts. POTUS, please remove this trait. Please get rid of it. Nobody likes it. Okay, alien enemies don't really fully have a gimmick, but they do have a thing where they basically have their own chapter called Into the Future. They also have another thing called Cats of the Cosmos, where we have starred aliens. In these chapters, you'll need the superior treasures. You'll need all treasures, 100%, because what the treasures do is they make them weaker. If you don't have any of the treasures, they basically have insane stats that make it almost impossible for you to beat, especially in Captain the Cosmos when you get the starred aliens, because those ones require the treasures, or else they have insanely high stats, because you don't have the treasures. So this trait's kind of annoying because you need to do a lot of treasure grinding to make sure you're able to actually fight them. Black enemies, like the previous traits so far, don't really have a thing to them, but they basically just tend to have high knockback counts. A great example of this would be Doge Dark, the black variant of Doge, which has 8 knockbacks, or Gory Black, the black variant of Gory, with 10 knockbacks. Other than their knockback counts, the only thing special about them is, I guess, their damage. Gory Black at 100% has 6k DPS, and Doge Dark has 1.5k DPS, which is pretty high for early game. So Angel enemies don't have anything that all Angel enemies have, like high knockbacks. Only some enemies have that, such as Gabriel, who has 10 knockbacks. Other enemies like Divine Cyclone only have 1. And damage-wise, some enemies like Divine Cyclone have 76,000 damage per hit, and other enemies like Sleipnir, another enemy that's Angel, has only 2.2k damage. And they're not really health based either, because Sleipnir only has 363,000, while Gabriel only has 13,000, and Divine Cyclone only has 1.4 million. They all have very different things. There's nothing really that clumps them all together. Zombie enemies are pretty cool because most of them have 2 different abilities that they have. One of them is Revive. Revive is basically a thing where after you kill them, they come back with a certain amount of percentage of health unless you use Zombie Killer. Most enemies have only 1 revive, but some of them, like Coffin Zoj, have unlimited. The other ability is called Burrow. It basically where once they meet up with one of your cat units, it will go into the ground, move underground for a bit, and then come back up and start attacking. Most of them will, again, like with Revive, only do it once, but some enemies, like Miss Haka, will infinitely burrow until they get to your base. Aku enemies have a thing called Shield, which is basically a protective barrier with a certain amount of health. While this barrier is up, they cannot take any status effects or take any damage whatsoever. However, while the barrier is down, they can take as much damage as you deal. Once the enemy gets knocked back, however, it regenerates at full health, so you need to deplete it again. This makes some enemies like Midnight D, a Rain D variant that has a shield, very annoying because every single time you break its shield, and you knock it back, its shield regenerates. The other ability Aku enemies have is called Death Surge. It's basically a surge that appears upon killing the enemy that deals however much damage the enemy dealt. This can sometimes be devastating, or sometimes do barely any damage. Relic enemies are pretty cool. They have an ability called Curse, where basically if one of your cat units is cursed, if they have an ability where they can freeze like a red enemy or so, they can no longer freeze a red enemy. They basically remove any status effects that you can inflict on an enemy, which is pretty annoying actually, but almost all relic enemies can curse. Some of them have a 100% chance to curse, like Otham, and others have only small chances to curse, like Relic Doge.